Hello, this is Lisa Elwine. We are back with another Passover snack. And this time our Passover snack, the question will be maybe how rabbinic was Paul? 1 Corinthians 11, we're all familiar with that as one of the passages post-gospel that refers specifically to the Passover or the Passover Seder. And I'd just like to take a few verses out of 1 Corinthians 11 and to show you that what Paul is writing to the Corinthians at the time of Passover is also found in the Mishnah, which is going to be the oldest written record of Jewish law concerning the same topic. And so if you want to find out about Jewish Passover in Jewish literature, you go to the Mishnah and you go to the tractate Pesachim, which means obviously Passover. All right, but they are the laws of Passover. There's also going to be some other parts of it. If you want a really good breakdown of the different sources of Jewish law, like the difference between the Mishnah, the Tosefta, the Gemara, the Talmud, the Becky book, Introduction to the Jewish Sources, is a really great reference book just to give you a brief overview of where each of these different parts of the Talmud come from. But I want to point out kind of the Talmudic Paul in 1 Corinthians 11 and to show you the relationship that's going to come from his rabbinic training, from his training in Jewish law. And I can give you the chapters and the verses here. So in 1 Corinthians 11, if we look at verse 25 through 27, Paul says, "In the same way, he took the cup also after supper. Therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord." All right, so now Paul is relating this to Yeshua. Where would he get the basic idea about this cup, this final cup, this one after supper, which we would probably know as Elijah's cup? Well, remember that in the Mishnah, Elijah's cup is going to be congruent with these two witnesses that we see in Revelation who were praying down basically plagues on people. And this final cup of Elijah, even though we like to play games with the kids about looking for Elijah at Passover, that cup is a cup of wrath, because that's exactly what Elijah prayed down on the prophets of Baal, is wrath. So the prayer that accompanies this particular cup in the Jewish tradition is a prayer of wrath. It's kind of not a good thing. In terms of, is this a blessing? Well, not really. It's a cup of, it's one of those, if you drink the cup and you drink it to the dregs, you are drinking wrath upon yourself. And so Elijah, who in the Jewish tradition is seen as that precursor of the Messiah, Elijah's the one who does defeat the prophets of Baal. So where is this wrath liturgy coming from in the Jewish tradition? They're taking it from Psalm 129, 6 through 7, Psalm 119, 25, and Lamentations 3:66. So when Paul starts talking about this last cup, this final cup, and seeing it as being able to produce guilt concerning the body of Yeshua, he's making this equation here because Elijah is that forerunner of Messiah. And so it is a cup of wrath to those who are drinking it unworthily. It's literally just praying a curse on yourself as you drink it, is because, like I said, it's not necessarily a blessing if you're drinking it unworthily, if you're not discerning that body. He says in verse 21, "For in your eating, each one takes his own supper first, and one is hungry and another's drunk." Why would this bother him? Well, in the Mishnah Berurah, 473:14, it says, "Even though it's permitted to drink one should be careful not to drink too much wine so as not to become intoxicated and unable to finish the Haggadah. So intoxication is a no-no at a Passover Seder in the Jewish tradition. This is exactly what Paul is telling the Corinthians. In verse 22, he says, what? Do you not have houses in which to eat and drink? Or do you despise the church of God and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? In this I will not praise you. Where would he get this idea? Well, it's in the Tosefta 10:1 to Pesachim 10 in the Mishnah. And we read there, it says, even the poorest in Israel shall not eat until they have arranged themselves at ease around the table. Nor shall a person have less than 4 cups of wine, even if they must be given him from the funds devoted to the charitable support of the very poor. So in the Jewish tradition, it was up to the poor person's community to ensure that every person could enjoy 4 cups of wine and that they could join the others at the table. In other words, you don't go ahead and eat and drink at the Passover Seder if the poor member of the party does not have the ability to do so, doesn't have the funds to purchase what he needs to celebrate. Paul says in verse 28, but a man must examine himself, and in so doing he is to eat of the bread and drink of the cup. Well, it's also in Pesachim 10. It says, in every generation, a person must regard himself as though he personally had gone out of Egypt. As it is said, and you shall tell your son in that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. Therefore it is our duty to thank, praise, laud, glorify, exalt, honor, bless, extol, and adore him, who performed all these miracles for our ancestors and us. And us. He brought us forth from bondage into freedom, from sorrow into joy, from mourning into festivity, from darkness into great light, and from servitude into redemption. This is a self-examination. And this is exactly what Paul is teaching the Corinthians. You have to examine yourself as if you yourself were brought out of Egypt when I came forth, what he did for me when I came forth out of Egypt. If you don't consider these things, it's not a proper Passover Seder. He says, for this reason, in verse 30, many among you are weak and sick, and a number of you sleep. Well, we've already really talked about that in terms of the cup of wrath, or Elijah's cup. But we also see that in Tosefta 10, 9b, and it's possibly where he's saying a number of you are sleeping. Sleep is a euphemism for death. And so if we're looking at Pesachim 10, 9 and 10, where it's talking about this, you see that there's that analogy of staying awake, not falling asleep, but in a spiritual sense, not falling asleep either, so that we're not drinking that judgment so that it will kill us. In verse 31, he says, if we judged ourselves rightly, we would not need to be judged. Where do we know something about self-judgment? Well, if we're praying the prayers, prayer in Hebrew is hipalel, and it means self-judgment. So when we're praying the prayers of the Hallel that are in the traditional Jewish Seder, then we're praying those prayers that are prescribed in the Mishnah. And what are we doing? We're praying prayers that judge ourselves. And it says, if anyone is hungry, and by the way, there's an old rabbinic saying that says, he who judges himself, then there's no reason to be judged in heaven. Because you've already done it down here, then there's no reason for the heavenly court to be involved. So it's a very Jewish way of thinking of things. And finally in verse 34, he says, if anyone is hungry, let him eat at home so that you will not come together for judgment. In other words, if your belly's just hungry, eat at home. But when you're gathering together, then it is a form of corporate prayer. And if you're just worried about feeding your belly or feeding your own family and leaving everyone out, which is anti-Mishnah thought, which is for the poorest person among you, he says, if you're hungry, eat at home. Because if you're coming in here and you're acting this way, you're self-serving and you're not worried about the poor, then you're going to judge yourself. You're going to bring that judgment upon yourself because you're not properly judging yourselves. So in the passages in the Mishnah that talk about Passover, Paul has taken those same thoughts and he has conveyed them to the Corinthian congregation in a way that they can understand. And I think the same holds true for us. Can we read about the historical Seder in the Mishnah? Yes. But Paul's advice is the same. In 1 Corinthians 11, consider the poor and judge yourself. Those are the basics.